Welcome, everyone, to this week's edition of the MDI Science Cafe. Our subject today is combating pseudoscience online and in the classroom. I'm Fred Bever. I'm the Chief Communications Officer here, and I'm just sort of going slowly at the moment because people are still coming in to our cafe. All right, well, welcome again, everyone, to the March MDI Science Cafe. I am Fred Bever, Chief Communications Officer here at MDI Biolab. Many people here will recognize others on our team and as well as each other. This is a very timely topic in today's world, and we have two very engaged and expert guests on these issues. I'll start with Liz Marnik, our own Liz Marnik, Dr. Liz Marnik. She received her doctorate in immunology and genetics from Tufts. She performed her postdoctoral research here at MDI Biolab, and then she went on to become an assistant professor at Husson University before she then joined our staff last year as our science education and outreach director. Now, that gives her lots of expertise in science communications, but she's developed above and beyond kind of expertise herself in her free time when she's often known as Science Whiz Liz. That's her online persona as a public influencer on biomedical science and related manners. Liz spends a lot of time clarifying and amplifying science-based facts on issues such as vaccines or COVID-19, helping people to wade through false and misleading information that can proliferate on the internet. She'll tell you more about that in a minute. She has more than 40,000 followers now. Liz, is that the latest number? And then we have with us Melanie and Trecek-King. She's trained in ecology. She's an associate professor of biology at Massasoit Community College in Brockton, Mass. There she teaches a general education science course that's designed to teach skills, not facts, and she'll tell us more about what that division means. She's also the creator of Thinking is Power. That's an online resource dedicated to skills-based critical thinking, information literacy, science literacy, and she also is the education director for the Mental Immunity Project and the Cognitive Immunology Research Collaborative, which is the acronym is CIRCE. Is that how you pronounce it, Melanie? CARCE. And those organizations aim to advance and apply the science of mental immunity to inoculate minds against misinformation. Now, I'm going to invite everyone here. When you have questions, both Elisabeth and Melanie are going to make some presentations at the beginning. And when you have questions, you can raise your hand. You can write them in the chat. I think people who are in Marin can notify us through the chat or through one of the staff who are there in Marin with you. And so one way or another, we'll hopefully get you engaged in this conversation. Now, as we engage in this discussion, I just want to remind everyone that civility is key to productive dialogue. We might have different perspectives, but our shared goal is to shed light on these issues. So please be respectful in your comments and questions. And if we have agreements, perhaps just let's go at them with curiosity rather than hostility, so we can have a nice, thoughtful exchange. And just before I turn it over to our guests, you all in the audience, as we proceed through this, think about your own experiences with misinformation or pseudoscience, whether it's in your life, with your kids, with educators, or online. Have you seen it out there? Have you done anything about it? Maybe have you reposted something that you then said, and how would you handle that? So, and those are some of the questions that we can ask from our informed guests. So let's start with Melanie and Trecek-King. Thank you so much for joining us. And why don't you give us your précis? What is your work all about in this space?
Yeah, so first of all, thank you for having me. I'm honored to be here. And I prepared a bit of a presentation. Did you want me to start there, or did you want me to ask some questions? Or yeah, okay. So fingers crossed that this goes well. Really? You know, it's still a victory. Okay, so As Fred said, I specialize in mis and disinformation and on helping students not think critically through these things so that they don't fall for them. And one of the truisms about mis and disinformation is that they have been around for as long as humanity has been exchanging information, and we can all fall for them. So I'm going to tell you a brief story here and highlight some key concepts along the way. So in 1981, the CDC identified a rare form of pneumonia in gay men in mostly New York and California. Over the next few years, the disease was named AIDS, and then HIV, the virus that causes it, was discovered, and cases were growing very quickly. This was a new pandemic. People were scared. They didn't know what caused it. They didn't know how it was spreading. There weren't any treatments yet. And because of the population that it impacted, there was a lot of homophobia and bigotry surrounding, like you see, gay disease. It was called gay pneumonia. By the late 80s, there was a pretty strong consensus emerging that the origin of HIV was from wild chimps in Africa, probably as from bushmeat hunting. And today, over 35 million people have died from this pandemic. It is the longest running pandemic that still impacts us today with incredible numbers of deaths. Now, our story here also involves this man named Boyd Graves, or Ed Graves. He was born in 1952 in Ohio, by all accounts, extremely intelligent. He went to the Naval Academy, and a few weeks before he graduated from law school in 1992, he tested positive for HIV. His research led him to believe that HIV was created as a bioweapon at Fort Detrick in Maryland. There was actually a bit of truth to that. Fort Detrick had been the site of some bioweapons testing, but he believed that it escaped from the lab and/or it was a genocide against Black people. He actually thought he had contracted HIV from a dart gun that he called a microbio-inoculator that could infect people from up to 100 feet away, or potentially mosquitoes that had been engineered by government contractors and escaped. He published this book here, The State Origin, Evidence for the Laboratory Birth of AIDS. I have the man who solved AIDS up at the top there because around parts of Africa where the pandemic was really hitting hard, he had been termed the man who solved AIDS. And he even said here, if they didn't want me to discover the true origin of AIDS, they shouldn't have given it to me. He argued his case in front of the federal government several times, even appearing before the Supreme Court. Now, we're going to circle back to Ed Graves's story here. But there's one more thing that's important to tell about him, which is that he was also not just searching for a cause, but for cures. And in 2001, he was injected with Tetrasil, which we now know today is tetrasilver tetroxide. It's an alternative therapy that doesn't really do much. Nevertheless, he noted that his health improved immediately. And he promoted it as a miracle treatment that could cure AIDS within 3 weeks. Okay, so today we know that Ed Graves fell for harmful misinformation. We're going to circle back to him in just a second. But at the center of our story here is misinformation. Misinformation is false or misleading information, and it's a spectrum, right? There's some that's very wrong, there's some that's kind of wrong, and intent doesn't matter, by the way. When we're talking about misinformation, people can spread false or misleading information without knowing that they're doing so. And importantly, misinformation rides along with information. Every time we share information, there's a chance that we share something that's also not true. The reasons that we fall for misinformation are, it confirms our biases. If we already think something could be true, why would we question it? It triggers emotions. It makes us angry, afraid, outraged, hopeful. Even like pseudoscience, we fall for pseudoscience because we need hope. Misplaced trust, motivated reasoning, driven by things like what we want to be true, our identity, especially if we've publicly staked our identity on these beliefs, on our tribe, so our group that also holds these beliefs. And the more we hear it repeated, the more likely we are to believe it. And then fast and intuitive thinking. There's so much information coming at us these days. We can't think critically through everything. So often what happens is we get overloaded. And so we default to fast judgments, and those judgments are often emotional and biased. And then how we make sense of information. As science educators and communicators for a very long time, we've operated under the information deficit model, which is that people just don't understand the facts. They don't know the facts. So how could we help someone like Ed Graves? Well, we would just need to tell him the information and then he would believe it. But we know that's not true. I really like Willard Van Orman Quine's web of belief, in that instead of the mind as an empty blank slate to fill things in, it's more like a web where all of the bits of information, all of our beliefs, form interconnected systems. And if you go in far enough, there's some at the very center. Those core beliefs are those that are most important to us. We hold closest to us. You know, like when someone tells you you're wrong about like what the capital of Australia is, and you're like, yeah, okay. Or if somebody tells you you're wrong about something like the cause of AIDS in Ed's case, that's likely to trigger defensiveness. That same part of the brain that gets activated when there's a physical threat gets activated when there's a threat to these core beliefs. But importantly, they're all connected. So even if there's an outer belief that's less important, it makes sense in the coherent whole to that person. So you can't go in and remove it without fixing the whole. As far as misinformation goes, there's lots of different types of misinformation. And the ones we're going to focus on right now are science-related misinformation. Two sides of this, things that we want to believe and things that we don't want to believe. So pseudoscience is information that is false, unfalsifiable, or even unsupported. And because we want to believe we have a low standard of evidence, whereas science denial is a refusal to accept well-supported science. And so what do? We set impossibly high standards of evidence. But they're like two sides of the same coin, where if we don't want to accept something, we're more likely to replace it with a pseudoscience. Here's a natural cure for cancer, for example. The appeal to nature is ubiquitous throughout alternative medicine. And here we have one of the most textbook examples of disinformation campaigns, which was the tobacco industry's attempt to not have their products regulated, not by convincing the American public that it was healthy to smoke cigarettes, or even that it wasn't necessarily bad for you. It's just that we didn't know enough to act. And so why would we? This here was leaked from one of their memos. They were fully aware of the impacts of their products by the 50s, but here in 1969, doubt is our product, since it's the best means of competing with the body effect that exists in the minds of the general public. Their goal was to sow doubt. This is a disinformation campaign in that it is purposefully deceitful. Oh, sorry, let me go back here. If you dig down far enough into any form of misinformation, you're probably going to get to a conspiracy theory. And that it's the best, easiest way to explain why experts don't agree with you, why reliable sources of information don't agree. Well, the doctors are hiding it. Scientists are hiding it. They're covering it up. False misinformation that would disconfirm the idea that was planted, or missing evidence was covered up. There's always an excuse. Conspiratorial thinking is it's enticing. It's alluring. It offers us simple and easy explanations that help us confirm the narratives we already have in our head. The problem is it's a trap, because once you get down that rabbit hole, it's very hard to get back out. And to be clear, there are real conspiracies. Right? There are times when people have actually conspired to great harm, but conspiratorial thinking is not the answer. It's not the way to find conspiracies. For that, we need critical thinking, not conspiratorial thinking. So if we circle back to Ed here, Ed passed away at the age of 57 in 2009. His cause of death is not public. He's shown here with his logic flowchart that proved the lab leak. Ed denied science. He denied what we knew about the origins of HIV/AIDS, and he fell for pseudoscience, like the treatment. And why was all of this information not consistent with mainstream information? Well, the government was hiding it. Obviously, it was a bioweapon. He did not trust, and that lack of trust made him vulnerable. Now, this was a Black man in the early 80s that was trying to figure out why he was sick, a gay Black man. It is understandable why he wouldn't trust. And actually, even as late as 2005, up to half of Blacks polled in the United States said that HIV was man-made. And when asked why, what they would say is things like, well, Tuskegee, right? They're not wrong. The government had done this before. So it was logical the government could do it again. But this causes harm to people who believe it. People who believed this kind of thing would refuse condoms at government facilities because the condoms were being used to spread HIV. They would refuse clean needles. They would refuse treatment. So the people who believe this felt empowered by it, but it actually harmed them. So here's Tuskegee. I'm assuming you are aware of Tuskegee, nevertheless, for the sake of time. This here is from an article in the Indian English language newspaper, The Patriot, in 1983. So AIDS may evade India, mystery disease caused by US experiments. This article was supposedly by a well-known American scientist, but it was anonymous. A few years later, this report called the Siegel Report came out. It was by a French biologist, Jakob Siegel, who was actually East German and Russian-born biophysicist, not a medical doctor. He claimed in this report that AIDS had been created as a bioweapon at Fort Detrick, and that the agents had infected gay prisoners, who then spread it to gay populations in New York and California. By 1987, it had been picked up in major media outlets in 80 countries around the world in 30 different languages. Here's Dan Rather covering it in 1987. Now, remember, in the 1980s, the US was also fighting a Cold War with the Soviet Union. And the Soviet Union could not compete with the United States government when it came to military strength. So what they did instead was fought a disinformation warfare. This entire story that Ed Graves believed, and that so many African Americans believe, was a disinformation campaign. It was planted by the Soviet Union, purposefully targeting marginalized populations that were prone to distrust authoritative sources of information. And they planted something later, referred back to the original, planted something later, referred back to the original, rinse, wash, repeat over and over and over again, until finally it took on a life of its own and is still believed by lots of people today. There is a difference between mis and disinformation, right? Disinformation is a purposeful strategy of lying, deceit, usually to sow doubt and to divide an enemy or a population. But importantly, people who fall for it are victims. And if they believe it and pass it on, it becomes misinformation. Now, when I talk about misinformation, all of these aspects are important here. There's a lot of great resources that are fighting misinformation by helping us understand the misinformation itself, and that's important. But if we don't understand our vulnerabilities and why we fall for it, then we're likely to fall for misinformation, even if we can recognize its characteristics. We're all susceptible. And the moment we think we're not is when we're even more vulnerable. Thank you.
So that's a great setup. And somebody, actually, Julia had a question that paralleled one of my own. One small thing that struck me when you said that if you present something with a piece of information that triggers that danger defensive response, do you know like what part of the brain is involved there? Can you just tell us a little bit more about that just before we go on to Liz?
Yeah, that's the amygdala, the very primitive emotional part of the brain that we say that it's responsible for the 4 Fs. So fight, flight, freeze, or mating. So those 4 Fs, though, are very basal, right? They're primitive. And that's actually in a textbook. I did not come up with it on its own, but um, when we face a physical threat, we don't have to think twice about it, right? You can feel yourself get emotional, the adrenaline kicks in, and you go to war. I don't know about you. I felt the same thing, though, when somebody comes after one of my beliefs that's really important to me. I right? I do this, I get defensive, and I go to war. But it's not to defend me, it's to defend a belief that I've tied to me. Actually, one of the most important aspects of critical thinking is separating our beliefs from our identity. It is very difficult to be objective about a belief once it's attached to us. We don't want to be wrong.
Great. Thanks, Melanie. And I hope people, if you have questions, I certainly do. If you'll, which is something that people sometimes say about when they are voting misinformation. I have questions, but it's not that I'm saying it's wrong. But let's go to Liz now. But please do raise your hand, your virtual hand, or write something in the chat, and we'll try to get to your questions. So thanks very much again, Melanie and Liz. It's your turn.
Yeah, thank you. So I'm going to also tell a story to begin with. I'm going to tell a little bit about my background, and if you guys have questions, we can get to it after as well. But I was raised in an anti-vaccine, anti-science household. My mom did not vaccinate me growing up, or my brother. And when I finally was an adult, I had, by that point in time, had made my own decision. I went to talk to my mom and I asked her, what was it why did she make that decision? And she told me that she had a newborn baby. I was her firstborn child. And she went to the doctor's office because she had heard some scary claims about vaccines causing people to go deaf and other things that concerned her. And she asked her pediatrician at the time about these things. And he told her, you vaccinate your kid because I told you to. And he wouldn't answer her questions. So she took me and she left that practice, and I didn't see a pediatrician again for like a long time. We didn't go to a doctor at all again after that. And she instead went into this anti-vax community at that time and found her answers there because they were willing to talk to her. They were willing to explain why they thought this, and they were willing to answer her questions in ways that other individuals weren't willing to do. And that really set her off on a path of distrusting all medical intervention. I had to beg her to take antibiotics when she had cellulitis when I was a teenager. It was not great. And as a result of that, I ended up being homeschooled for a long period of time. I was also raised in a very conservative household, and they were worried that public school would corrupt me. And so they homeschooled me for a while. I then went to a private Christian school for a while. Then we couldn't afford that, so I was homeschooled again. And by the time I got to 11th grade, I was like, I can't do this anymore. So I begged my mom to put me in public school. And she did, after lots of cajoling. And 11th grade was my first time I ever was in a science lab. And I fell in love with chemistry. I loved learning all of these things. And my chemistry teacher was fantastic. And she really saw that I was good at what I did. And she and my biology teacher at the time encouraged me to go to college to pursue science. And honestly, until that point in time, I didn't know what college was. I didn't know how to apply to college. I had no idea what I was doing. And these two teachers really sat down, they helped me apply. They helped me apply for scholarships. And from that point in time, I ended up deciding that I wanted to be a scientist. So I entered college, but I entered college unvaccinated, completely unvaccinated. And I slowly started to learn about science. But at the same time, I started to build relationships with my professors and with my friends who now were actually telling me, hey, they were vaccinated as a kid. And I slowly started to deconstruct all of these things I had been taught and realize that a lot of the fears that my mom had at the time are not true. And she had kind of instilled some of those fears in me because it was entrenched in the way I was raised. But then I had my own children. And by that point in time, I had I had graduated with a bachelor's in biochemistry. I had gone on to get a PhD in genetics and immunology. I was studying the immune system. I had gotten vaccinated in my 20s right before I went to go get my PhD because I knew it was what I needed to do at that point. But I had my first child, and I was sitting there looking at my newborn baby, being like, man, this is a big responsibility. Having to make sure that my kid is safe is a hard thing to do. And for me, that meant that I chose to vaccinate my son because I knew that the things that we were trying to protect him against, that the vaccine would help. Things like measles, which we now hear on the news, right? But at the end of the day, becoming a mother myself made me realize that that motivating factor was the same for my mom. She wanted to keep me safe too. But because nobody was willing to engage with her or answer her questions, she figured the way to do that was to not vaccinate me. Whereas I had the ability, built relationships, was able to change my mind, and I chose to vaccinate my kids for the exact same reason, because I wanted to keep them safe. And it was really that experience that led me to do a lot of the work that I do in my spare time. So as Fred mentioned, I do science communication on social media, and that started in the pandemic. And that was because I still have family members. My mom still doesn't trust vaccinations. So I was starting to see all of this misinformation spreading on social media in March of 2020, 5 years, like almost exactly to the day today. And that really started me on this journey of trying to address these things on social media. And I want to talk a little bit about why I chose social media. So for better or for worse, half the world uses social media. Facebook, YouTube, and Instagram are the top platforms used, and nearly half of US adults get their news from social media. This means that the traditional news sources are going down. So unfortunately, whether we like it or not, people are on social media. That means the things that Melanie talked about misinformation and disinformation, now aren't being spread just by newspapers or other ways. They're now also being spread on our phones or in our computers. And as Melanie touched on earlier, a claim is often believed more when it was frequently repeated. And this is one of the dangers of social media, because now all of a sudden you see the same misinformation repeated, repeated, and repeated, and it makes people who otherwise wouldn't think twice now wonder, is there something they're missing? Because all of a sudden they see this same misinformation time after time. It's also now, there's a tendency where somebody might see something and they're like, wow, I don't know if this is true, but if it's interesting, but if it is true, it's really interesting, so I'm going to share it. And a lot of times misinformation is a lot more interesting than the truth. So this is another thing that happens, is the algorithm perpetrates like more and more misinformation being spread. And this is really the bad side of social media. It's a much easier ecosystem for misinformation to spread much more quickly than it could have been before. But at the same time, misinformation does have some positives. The top left article here in the Huffington Post was actually written by one of my social media followers, who wrote about how my account and the account of other science communicators actually helped her change her mind. She had been anti-vax, and she changed her mind based on the information that she was seeing on these science social media accounts. And then there is studies that show this too, that you can use social media to disseminate evidence-based information, and it can be really beneficial in combating misinformation. So there really are two sides of the coin here. It is bad in the sense that we now are using social media perhaps in ways that we shouldn't be, and it creates this ecosystem of misinformation, but at the same time, it allows us to also reach people that maybe wouldn't have been reached in other ways. Now, Melanie touched on this as well, but one thing I do want to stress is that we are all susceptible to misinformation. Oftentimes, I think we have an us versus them mentality where we're like, nope, I'm not going to fall for misinformation. But the reality is we are all at risk of falling for misinformation. So I'm going to give you guys an example of this. So you may have seen headlines recently, debates happening about whether or not President Trump meant in his address last week transgenic or transgender mice. And I first came across this in a Facebook post that's here on the left of my screen, where somebody was sharing about this podcast or this account that was saying transgender mice, and this scientist was like, no, he meant transgenic mice. And I was like, great, now people are getting transgenic and transgender confused. And I almost shared this Facebook post on my own Facebook. And I stopped and I was like, before I share this, I should see what's actually happening here. So about 3 weeks ago, I went down this rabbit hole and I found the origin of this information. And it came from a white coat waste project website, which is a terrible website. I don't like to drive traffic to it. It's full of misinformation and disinformation. But this was the source of the claim. They found legitimate NIH studies that were being funded with the intent of helping to improve care for a lot of people, including those who are transgender. And in each single study, there were mentions of transgender individuals. So the fact remained that no, there wasn't a mistaking of transgenic mice for transgender mice. They meant transgender. And that matters because when we're arguing right now, what's happening on social media is a bunch of scientists are arguing about what did he actually mean. We're focusing our attention on the wrong thing because they're trying to explain to people why genetically engineered mice, which are transgenic mice, they're trying to explain to people why they are important, when that's actually not what the message is. The issue is that they're trying to say that this research isn't important because it could benefit transgender individuals. And there's a lot of reasons why that's wrong, including the fact that they deserve research onto health issues that impact them, but also that the research will benefit all of us in different ways. So at the end of the day, when you think about it, we can think about misinformation as this huge dumpster fire, but you also have a role to play in preventing this misinformation. So when you're communicating with other people, fact check. Make sure you're checking to see if your information is actually correct. Listen to what they're saying. Seek to understand what's driving them. Just like my mom was driven by a desire to keep me safe, what is driving their spread of this misinformation? Be compassionate. And then when you are communicating with people, make sure you're trying to do it in a way that they can understand. All right. And with that, I know there were some questions in the chat too.
Fred, you're muted.
Fred, you're muted.
We were talking before the show who was going to be the first one to do that. So while we wait for people to bring up their questions in the chat or by going to the bottom of your screen and raising your little virtual hand, is that in the react? Yeah, in the reaction or in the, yeah, I think that's where you got to go. One question, Liz, if you don't mind, it goes to this very affecting personal story that you told. When you decided that you were going to get vaccinated yourself, was that like a long process? Did because you had an entire family history of investment in the idea that they're bad and unsafe. Was it sort of a gradual thing, or did you finally just go, no, I'm going to go do it? Or what was that like? Did you have to how did you unwind the complex of feelings and beliefs that you were given as a child to get to the point where you actually walked into the clinic or the doctor's office and got a vaccine?
It took a long time, right? So I wasn't vaccinated. I entered college as a freshman. I was a science major, and I didn't get vaccinated until I was about to graduate. So it took 4 years, I would say, of deconstructing the information that I've been taught. Because, right, for me, not only was it related to how I was raised, but my mom also made it a very important part of our faith because we had a religious exemption. So I was in college, like learning all of these things that I had never learned before. Like I had never even learned about evolution before I went into school for the first time. So I was learning all of these things. I don't think I even understood what the immune system was prior to going to college. So for me, it was really like learning this information, but then also wrestling with the fact that you can be a good person and make different decisions than what my mother made. Because for me, right, it was like this was tied up into so much of who we were, to what Melanie said, with being a part of our identity, that I had to realize that multiple things can be true at one time. You didn't have to just believe one thing to be a good person, which is what I had been taught. So it was really learning the information and then building relationships with my professors who answered my questions and my friends who were willing to share their stories. And then finally, one of my friends went with me that day and went to the clinic with me. Because even then I was still kind of nervous because I was like, I trust this, I trusted the science by this point, but it's hard to not let those things that had been ingrained in you, like, um, kind of sow doubt. So she went with me. They didn't know what to do at the point in time. They had to call the CDC to figure out what vaccine schedule to give me because I was like 23 at this point. They now have a catch-up schedule, but they didn't at that point in time. But yeah, so it was a long process.
But by the time you got there, you felt good about it.
I
And
did,
I
yeah, but I
think
didn't tell
about,
my mom for a year.
yeah.
So,
Lots
yeah,
of people tell your
I
mom.
waited a long time before I finally told her.
There's so much information that's come out, and you both have talked about a few things that we can do to address it, and misinformation and disinformation, recognize it. But Jerry and others are asking tips. What more can you give us that are sort of handholds on this world where we can address it in our own lives, whether it's online or with our own children or our friends? Um, what are just the tools that are available to us instead of just sort of flailing and going, you're wrong.
Do you want me to take this one?
Go ahead. Yes.
Um, I would say the single most important thing you can do is to be skeptical, not just of what you hear from others, but of your own beliefs. Because if we're not skeptical, if you don't listen to that part of your brain that says, wait, is this true? Then you're not going to check. So be skeptical. And then as far as fact checking goes, there is something called lateral reading. I'm just trying to explain it here. And if I need to do something else, please let me know. In the olden days, we would teach people how to check sources and claims by looking through a website. So, for example, if you land on a new website that you're unfamiliar with, go to the About section and their mission. Who do they say they are? Um, Check their links. Does it seem current? The language, is it inflammatory? Do you notice logical fallacies? You could spend eons on a site, and we now know that the longer you're on a site, even if it's to determine if it's reliable or not, the more likely you are to be misled by that site. So the best thing you can do is leave it, and instead of reading vertically, read laterally. Open a new tab and search key terms, either the source and something like reliable, or the claim and something like fact check. And then use the power of the information ecosystem, other reliable sources, to let you know about the validity of that claim or the reliability of that source. And by the way, yes, Wikipedia is a really good place to start. If it's something that you're unfamiliar with, do go to Wikipedia. It's shockingly accurate. Like, don't end there, but Wikipedia also cites its sources, so follow those. I go to Wikipedia if it's something that I'm unfamiliar with. So, but the point is, be skeptical first, and then search other sources to see what they say.
How is AI doing in that regard? A lot of us now are, if we have a question about something, we might type it in and we'll get an AI generated answer. My sister did this the other day because she felt all prickly after being outside in the cold and taking a hot shower. And the AI told her to get to the emergency room right away. And she's already a hypochondriac. She called my other sister, who's an emergency room doctor, who said, no, you're fine. But I wonder, do you have any sense yet of whether those kinds of tools could become more reliable, like Wikipedia is, because you can follow all the sources, when we use search engines now?
Yeah. Liz, I would love to hear your thoughts on this. I have my own story with this. Like, I was recently doing a video on the botany of the food that we eat. So I'm a botanist, so I'm a plant ecologist, and I was doing a video on the parts of plants that we eat. And so I asked Gemini, what are examples of petioles that we eat? So, like a petiole is there's the stalk, and then there's the leaf, and then the petiole is what attaches the leaf to the stalk. So I asked it for petioles, and it didn't tell me anything. And then it said celery was a good example of a stalk. And I'm like, celery's not a stalk, celery's a petiole. Oh, you're right. It's important to get this right. Thank you for that clarification. Okay, so can you give me an example of I think I said stalk again. Oh, celery. Like, I just told you that was wrong. But the point is, if I didn't know that, I would have just believed it and not have been skeptical. It now tells you that it could be wrong, so double check and take that advice.
Yeah, I would right now not trust AI. For example, I had a student use it last year, and they were writing a paper about the protein that I discovered and named with Dustin at MDIBL, and I'm the only person who's written on this protein. And it made up sources of information for this student. So I caught the student because I had them come to my office, and I was like, where did you find all these papers about loader one? And he was like, oh, like I found them online. And I was like, no. I was like, first of all, these papers don't exist because I'm the only person who's published on this at that time. And second of all, I looked and the references are fake. Like they're not, like they didn't exist at all. Like totally made up references. So I would be very cautious with trusting AI. That being said, I do know of people who are working on AI tools as a way of trying to help people have conversations about like vaccine safety and stuff like that. So we might get to a point where there are specific tools that will be useful. I would not trust it right now. You're muted again, Fred. Sorry.
Nice.
Terrible with that. I just want to remind everyone in Marin Auditorium that if you have a question, bring it to Jerry. She's wearing the orange, and or at least that's what it looks like online. And she'll relay your questions. Looks like she might have a taker here.
I also see in the chat, when we maybe wait, is that Hip was asking, how do we encourage critical thinking in the adults in our circles without sounding patronizing or like we're calling them stupid?
Or obnoxious, and because in the political environment online, lots of people who are scientists are just calling people who are promulgating some wrong things stupid.
Yeah.
So similar to that, and Pippa asked, how do you not be patronizing? Is that important?
Yes.
Actually, Liz, can you because we were having a conversation earlier when we were talking about the transgender versus transgenic, and as a science communicator, I've noticed a lot of fellow science communicators sharing the misinformation version of that and attempts to correct them in comments. Now, I didn't because I didn't know enough, but attempts to correct them in the comments did not go well. And actually, I often see this even where I know misinformation. They're communicating misinformation. And when you gently try to call it out, and we could talk about strategies to do that as well, because you don't always want to do it in the comment section. Nevertheless, people will say something like, well, but we know they're wrong anyway, and they would lie anyway. So what does it matter if we're not 100% right, or if we're not, we can lie too because they are, or something to those effects. And I think those are highlighting the tribal nature of this knowledge, and that doesn't get any of us closer to the truth.
I agree. I would say definitely when I'm having conversations with people who I see that are sharing misinformation, I think it depends on who they are for me to engage with them, right? Because I think how much of a relationship you have with them, for better or for worse, can impact how they'll receive information from you. So for example, if it's somebody that I know, I don't do it in the comment section because I feel like can be a little bit like disruptive because you're doing it in front like publicly, right? Because other people could see that. So I might text them if I have their phone number, or I might call them, or I might do it in a DM, in a message, because if I know them, I'm hoping that my relationship with them can help a little bit with that information that's being relayed. If it's a complete stranger, a lot of times it's probably not useful to engage. to an extent. I
Okay.
try to combat it by putting good information out there instead.
And one other thing with that, because it depends on who it is, everything that you just said. But I find that there's often a lot of people watching the exchange in the comments versus people who are actually participating. And so with well-placed comments that are kind and empathetic and an honest attempt to share good information and respectful dialogue, that it can influence the people that you don't even know are watching.
You're muted again, Fred.
It's like some sort of terrible problem I have. Jerry, do you have someone from Marin that you can relay a question to us at this point?
Can you hear me? Oh,
And we had a little echo problem there.
Yep.
Maybe after
Yes,
this
yes.
question.
Sorry, Fred. No, I think we're good. We just had some folks sharing, personal experiences with AI and, scientists in particular, tracking down misinformation that AI is generating. So one example that Dr. Silva shared with us is that a former colleague or student shared with him that AI said that the spine on the spiny dogfish was poisonous, and he went and tracked it down and saw the actual reference. But in reality, he knows very much from firsthand experience that is not the case. And so, it's just a question of how do we start to combat these things and what that process looks like.
Well, and that gets to a question that I had, Jerry, that implicit in the conversation earlier was a couple of drivers of misinformation. And one is a moneyed interest, such as big tobacco. Another is a political interest, such as trying to just destabilize US society by Soviets or others, former Soviets or others. Then there's this strange world where it's not necessarily got a direct motive that you can identify, like money or political destabilization efforts. AI puts a whole new spin on that. But Melanie, you made that distinction between misinformation and disinformation, disinformation being very deliberate and motivated, misinformation different. But it's just as big, even if you don't have an actor who's instigating it.
Yeah, and
Right?
I'm sorry, you finish that?
No, or is there an actor?
I really struggle with this because to me, um, information that's false or misleading, we can attempt to address the falseness or why the information is misleading without knowing intent. And actually, if I claim that somebody is lying for various reasons, then I've actually shifted the burden of proof away from the misinformation itself and towards establishing that I know they're lying. And that's not always a useful tangent. If I know someone is lying, if we know someone is lying, it's important to call it out. People don't like to be lied to. But if we don't know, we can still address the falseness of the information. And sometimes I think that's actually a better way to go anyway. Ed Graves, he was not lying. I mean, could he have been? That's the problem with intent. It's really difficult to know. But he probably really believed it. And so we don't have to we don't have to prove that he was lying to address why the information isn't true or why it's harmful. Did I answer your question?
Yeah, I mean, I think it is probably bigger than we might be able to get at easily when there are not motivated actors. That such as AI isn't really motivated, at least not without being specifically used that way. So just, and we've talked about the emotional and even evolutionary reasons for being susceptible or even attracted to misinformation. So it's a big world. I'm wondering, though, what about like when we're talking to children, to our kids, our grandkids, when they're figuring out how to understand the world, what tools can we use? What are strategies? I mean, to
Yeah.
use with people who are, adolescent or pre-adolescent or even younger.
I have a story related to this, and then I know Melanie has some good things she teaches her students. But recently my son is 5, so he's in kindergarten, and he came home and he told me that he learned from a friend, not from his teacher, but he learned from a friend that daddy longlegs are the most poisonous spiders, but they don't actually hurt us because they don't have fangs. So I sat with him and I had this conversation with him, and I was like, okay, Owen. I was like, well, let's see if this information is true. Right. So I didn't automatically say it was. I didn't automatically say it wasn't. I sat Owen down and he and I looked the information up together. And we found out that no, that is not that is not actually true. But it was a way for him to be like, oh, not everything everyone tells me is true. And since then, we've had conversations where he'll now come to me and he'll be like, Mom, I heard this today. Can you help me figure out if it's true or not? So it's a way of cultivating that relationship with your kids so they start to question and be skeptical, to what Melanie said earlier, right? You want them to be skeptical. That is now my instinct. Like as a human, I'm like, everything I see, I'm like, oh, I don't know if this is true. Which means more work for me, but it's also helps me be less susceptible to misinformation. Melanie, what would you add?
Yeah, I also the biologist in me would say that daddy long legs aren't spiders. And also
We did also talk about that.
I love it. I love it. Yeah, I recently, my niece came to me. She's not supposed to be on social media, but she came to me and said, Aunt Melanie, I saw this Teletubbies conspiracy theory, and it was on YouTube. It was a TikTok video that had gotten shared on YouTube because that's what happens on social media now, right? The videos that are on TikTok go to YouTube, and so she saw it anyway. And quite frankly, that thing was terrifying. But I still, we can use it as an opportunity to teach students how to be skeptical and how to check. I think it's appropriate to do it at their age level, address claims that they would come in contact with. One of the qualms that I have would be with how we do this with schools, in that we we do a lot of protecting students from misinformation, and even to the point where schools shut down the kinds of websites that students can see. Um, but the moment students pull up their phones and they're not on the behind the firewall from the school's Wi-Fi, they're seeing everything. And so we need to be honest with ourselves about what they're seeing and actually give them tools to be able to understand it and navigate it. And so, yes, we should protect students from some of the worst stuff, but also not kid ourselves. They actually are probably seeing things that would horrify us.
We have, I think I might have missed a note from Dick Atley. I'm wondering if we can get him to join the conversation.
Am I on the conversation?
Yes,
You are.
we can hear you.
Oh, thanks. What I'm concerned about is, in terms of sources, I've maybe over the last several years, I've lived in a somewhat different world, because the doctors and researchers that I communicate with have been doing research, and I've seen a lot of research related to COVID and the vaccines over the last 4 years, which contradicts a lot of what you see in the press or what you hear from the government. And I think I do a just job on it, going back and looking at the studies, trying to analyze whether they're well done, on both sides of the issue. And it comes back to when somebody says, do your fact check. And you say, well, where do you do your fact check? Wikipedia. Wikipedia is absolutely fantastic in science. It's fantastic in history, in art. But when it comes to controversial things, Wikipedia is, from many of our points, absolutely deadly, because it takes a position and it locks it, and the people who know about it can't even edit to say, hey, this isn't really right. People whose biographies have been totally misrepresented, because they're on the outs from having taken a position that's different from the sort of overriding narrative. They're demonized and vilified, and they can't even change it to make it accurate how they live their life. So it still becomes a question of what is a valid fact checker? And if anyone has been paying attention, they realize that a lot of the fact check entities are actually paid for, and when we found this out, when they started doing Freedom of Information Acts to the government, are paid for by the government or are influenced by the White House. And so I'd like to think there was a good way to do fact checking, but I can't really figure out how to do it. I guess that's my concern, basically. There's two different worlds that people are living in, and if you're tuned into one, it doesn't even occur to you to fact check it because the assumptions are what they are. If you're in the other one, the same thing happens. So I'm just raising it as a complicating issue. I'm not sure how you answer it.
Well, where else do you guys go, Liz and Melanie?
Of my pay grade. Liz, what do you think?
So one of the things, right, is that there is I don't have a picture of it right now, but there's a hierarchy of evidence that is useful when you are thinking about the sources of information that you're dealing with. And that's because a lot of times people like to misrepresent single studies, or they like to say that studies done in a dish will automatically mean the same thing in a human, which is not true. So there's this pyramid that talks about like how you should weigh evidence when it is available, right? And so you should weigh things like a systematic review. And a systematic review is one that takes all the available data on a topic and pulls that data together and then runs independent analysis to get to certain conclusions. And that is a higher level of evidence that's more reliable than a single study because it's pooling all of this data together. So I can certainly send an email to you later after the fact. I'm sure you've signed up so we can get your email. And I can share with you some of those resources of how to think about what sources you're using for information. And from a scientific perspective, when I am looking at claims that might be contradictory, because there are certainly publications that do contradict each other, I am looking at that type of thing. Like, what kind of study was it? What kind of paper was it published in? What's the background of the scientist who did it? And those are things that help me figure out what information might be more reliable than others.
It's funny, during the pandemic, I saw lots of people doing their own research. And so my humble attempt at trying to address that was exactly this, is trying to understand what a systematic review is, what a meta-analysis, a consensus report. You know, they appear in different ways, but I don't know about you, Liz, but as a science communicator, I find when somebody has an idea that they think is true, it's so easy to go to even Google Scholar and find anything that you can find a study that supports anything you want to believe. And so next thing you know, there's like, well, homeopathy is real because look at this, or like, look, energy medicine works because of this. And it seems really sciencey, but there's obviously more to that than that, just that. So anyway, it's an attempt to back out from the single study kind of aspect of this. I kind of feel, Dick, like your question might be getting a bit more, well, I don't want to put words in your mouth. Did we answer your question?
Sorry, I was muted there. In a way, I'm familiar with systemic reviews, and I'm also familiar with the fact that they have to exclude certain things, and so they have their own ways of looking at things, so that even under those circumstances, you can't be sure because you don't know without going and looking if they tell you which ones were excluded, why they excluded them. So it's complicated, and I think my real problem is that there is so much going on in the background that we're not really familiar with that has come out in terms of the various NGOs that have been dealing with censorship and where they come from and how they get financed, that it just gets to be really hard trying to figure out what's real these days. And I guess I'm just expressing my frustration at it.
You know, am I on? One really, or two really great places to go are thinkingispower.org or com, Melanie.
Thank you.
There's tons of resources there for understanding, particularly how to communicate with young people and how to set things up for understanding in their world and their very online world. And I think we can put up a few. Melanie sent us a few different ways of presenting her body of knowledge there. So thinkingispower.com, pretty easy to remember and get to. We'll try to send out some more after this. Elisabeth Marnik is Science Whiz Liz. Whiz has an H in it, Science Whiz Liz. And you can find her on Substack and on Instagram. Liz, those are really your two major communications platforms. Is that right?
Correct. Yeah.
And again, all kinds of very direct, clarifying information, both about what science does and what it is, and how to tell the difference between science and non-science information, or information and disinformation. So I highly recommend those resources. And unfortunately, we've already gone over an hour. It was very fast, obviously a lot to talk about here. I want to thank everyone who participated today, and hope that, this is the kind of conversation, obviously, that we'll need to return to before too long. There's a whole bunch of related things that we never even got close to. So Melanie, Elisabeth, thank you very much for your time. I will mention that about a month from now, we'll have our next MDI Science Cafe, also an online version. And the title is Examining Potential PFAS Contamination of Well Water on Mount Desert Island, which is a body of expertise that Dr. Jane Disney of the Community Health Laboratory or Community Environmental Health Laboratory, and her colleague Richard Hilliard are developing a lot of expertise in how PFAS, forever chemicals, spread through our environments, how they move, in some cases, from aggregating places like schools into residential water supplies and into the watershed. And she's even starting to do some work on developmental effects, working with our own Ian Drummond and our own amazing zebrafish as a model for human health to study developmental effects. So that's going to be on the table at our next MDI Science Cafe, and we certainly hope you'll sign up for that. I wanted to call on Jerry Bowers here for a moment, our Chief of Staff and VP of External Communications, and see, Jerry, anything else you want to mention here before we sign off? Last questions for our guests? I'm gonna unmute you, Jerry.
There we go. Thank you. I was unable to do that myself. Sorry. No, I think we're good here. We're going to continue our conversation here in Marin a little bit. And I just want to give a huge shout out to Melanie and Liz for sharing your expertise and your experiences with us. This is such timely information and so important for all of us to be thinking about as we, share information and actually learn how to interpret what's true and what isn't. So I think this will definitely be a conversation that we will come back to over and over over the next few years. So thank you both so much. Appreciate it.
Just before we turn off, I'll surface a quote that Chuck Dinsmore, a longtime member of the MDI Biolab community, wrote down in the chat, and that Melanie calls her favorite ever. I presume it's Richard Feynman. His adage about being skeptical, quote, "The first principle is you must not fool yourself, and you are the easiest person to fool." So keep that in mind until the next time, everyone. Thanks so much. And thanks again, Melanie and Liz.
Thank you for having us.